The morning after my mother died, I took to my bed. This is not a euphemism. My arms were so heavy, my brain so cloudy that I could only lie there for days, drifting in and out of sleep like one of those 18th century sensitive ladies of a certain age with a doily bobby pinned to her hair. I was surprised by the totality of my grief because my mother had had Alzheimer's for years prior. And throughout that decade, I had developed a dislike for the demanding old woman who had replaced my talented, smart, funny, beautiful mother with a coarse yellow crow who couldn't even hold her head up by herself. What I'm saying is, I assumed that I had already mourned her over and over again. Au contraire, my body told me. What followed my mother's death was a grief so aggressive that it grabbed me by the throat, threatening to drag me down into some cold, dark, airless place more lonely and meaningless than any I had ever visited. And what I learned in the cumulus of the following gray weeks and months is that you can't skip past grief and simply carry on. Not grief like this, anyway. A friend once said, "You can stuff that all down and call it cancer." That's what this was like. And yes, eventually you do begin to feel better, even a lot better, I did. So much so that I returned to the third draft of my novel with completely unwarranted optimism. I tend to write novels like a novice hiker in a cave, blindly groping along the sweaty walls until I meet a dead end, and then I have to feel my way back to the entrance over and over again. It's shockingly inefficient. The book is loosely based on my parents' marriage, and it takes place in 1960s in Newmarket, England. The basic problem with the second draft was it didn't have a plot or an ending. And the two characters who were most elusive happened to be the ones based on my parents. So I decided to spend a month in England traveling around and writing, and specifically visiting Newmarket, where my family lived for over 50 years ago. Surely being on my own with all those memories would loosen the layers of narrative that had fossilized my memories. Perhaps if I unsettled the terrain of my childhood, I would see my parents more closely. It's hard for me to say this, but I think I was looking for something a bit divine. I'm a funky believer, straddling the empirical and the miraculous always. I can't quite conceive of a God, and I certainly can't imagine existence without her. I tend to believe people who tell me about talking to the dead, the synchronicity of the universe, miracles, visitations, the power of crystals, incantations, and manifestations. I believe it all. It's simply that those things don't tend to happen to me. That said, I was looking for a shakeup, and so I decided to say yes to absolutely everything that came my way in England. I followed people's recommendations. I read books that booksellers pressed into my hands. I gazed at the northern lights well past my bedtime. I said yes, yes, yes to it all. I even stayed in Shrewsbury, Shropshire, which sounds like a mythical place where elves live, pulling pranks on each other for eternity. A family friend, who I also hadn't seen in 50 years, offered to put me up there if I didn't mind, she said, pulling down a ladder to climb up to the attic where I could write. Are you fucking kidding me? Did I mind? How possible, I ask the universe, that every single fantasy of selfhood could be satisfied in that one image of me writing madly in an attic in Shrewsbury? Henry VII had stayed in that town the night before his victory on Bosworth Field, changing the course of European history forever. It was fucking insane. The inn where he stayed was within walking distance, and they had a happy hour. And then there was Newmarket, which looked smaller than I remembered it, but much the same. I cried a lot. outside the house I lived in, outside the school I went to. This wasn't just sadness over my parents' deaths. I would have recognized that. No, it was something existential, something my inexperienced spiritual self couldn't quite pin down, something that had to do with being older now, time passing, that intense and almost wordless understanding that permeates, that everything ends. A profound and universal truth that is the toughest, I find. All this was passing through me as I sat in a pub down the street from my hostel, weeping onto the pages of my notebook as I tried to language the unlanguageable. As I got up to order chips from the bar, a quintessentially British woman approached. By that, I mean that her thin blonde hair resisted any haircut to define it. And she had lots of teeth, and her eyes were what I would call unironically jolly. I've been sitting here, she said, pointing to her handbag on the table close by, watching you. She placed a hand on my arm. I'm psychic, she went on, and I'm sensing there's a lot of sadness around you. She waved her hand in a circular motion in front of my face. Well, yes, I said, the empiricist in me thinking, you bloody well saw me crying, so yeah. I said to her, my mother died recently. Ah, she said, nodding kindly. I liked her. Well, I would like to give you a reading. No charge. I'm in training, actually. So I need the practice, and there's something about you. I swelled with a little pride. I'm not gonna lie. Strangers never tell me that there's something about me. I'm 63, strangers rarely see me at all. That said, I have never had much luck with psychics. They tend to make me giggle. And a couple of times that I'd interacted with them was at parties, and I always feel like there's something I fundamentally don't understand about what we're supposed to be doing together. If they guess something right about my character or my family or my job, don't I already know that? And if they predict something in the future and I change it, were they right? And then there's the part where I think the most wonderful thing about being human is that we don't know what's going to happen. So why would I mess with that? But my first few weeks of saying yes to everything in England had already loosened up my thoughts. And let's face it, meeting a psychic in training in a hostel room in Newmarket, England was already a story that was writing itself. Yes, I said to Constance, let's do this. Already I felt duplicitous somehow, like a non-believer taking communion. This is how Constance came to be sitting across from me in my hostel room, me on the bed and her teetering on one of those impossible poofs that are placed in front of vanities. Don't say anything except yes or no, she told me. Okay, I said, squaring my shoulders and taking a deep breath. This should be easy enough. She stared earnestly into my eyes. I'm getting the name Trudy, she said. Can you take that on? Okay, you see, I already had so many questions, but she had told me only to say yes or no. What does take that on mean? Was she asking if I knew a Trudy or whether I could take on the idea that I might meet one in the future? My first roommate in college was named Gertrude Steenbergen, but that was definitely not something I could imagine taking on. Gertrude had only been my roommate for a couple of months and she barely ever talked to me, mostly because she slept all day with the curtains closed so tightly that I had to grope around in the dark for the simplest things. I memorized the amount of steps it took me to get to my desk where my school books were perched and then to the door. When Gertrude finally left to room with someone else and I could let light back in the room, I found a used Kotex stuck to the top of her desk. It had probably been there for weeks. No, I said to Constance, no Trudy. She cocked her head like she wasn't sure she entirely believed me. This is supremely silly, I thought. I should just let her off the hook somehow and tell her that I'm not a good bet for someone in training. I'm too literal or not literal enough. I waited as she looked at me softly. Then she said, "What about David? I'm feeling David. Can you take that on?" Well, everyone knows a David, I thought, but no, I couldn't take it on because there wasn't a really close David in my life, and the ones that I was fond of were very much alive. Wait a minute, is that what she meant? Any David or a dead David? No, I said. She said, "I really feel a David." I internally waffled. Should I dredge up a David that I didn't even feel like taking on? I didn't want her to be disappointed. She'd left the pub, walked down the street. I'd taken her at her word that I didn't have to pay. She should get something out of this, even if I wasn't. So I decided to throw her a bone. "I'm here in Newmarket because don't tell me." She said, "Only yeses or nos." Really? I thought, because so far it's just no's. A yes might feel really good. "I'm getting," she said, circling her palm in front of my face, which almost threw her off the poof, "art. Are you an artist?" Bingo! Yes! I almost yelled, and I stifled an urge to high-five her. She smiled, all teeth, and said, "An artist, yes, a painter." Sort of. I was an artist, but no, not a painter. Was I supposed to say yes or no? I nodded slowly and tipped my head from side to side to indicate that she was warm, not hot. "Yes," she said, "you're a painter who paints landscapes." "No." "Portraits?" "No." "Ah, I see." Did she? She said something about the challenges of being a painter, and then she said something about my art studio, and I could feel the whole thing going off the rails. "I'm a writer," I blurted out. She looked at me mildly confused, which was not hard to understand after my mixed messaging. What I wanted to say was my mother was a painter. She was extraordinary, blending realism with non-realistic elements that were surprising, but were something like an unexpected line in a poem. But I didn't say any of that, mostly because she was off and running with the writer info. As she happily babbled on, I had plenty of time to ask myself why I had really invited Constance to my room. Was it just because I thought it would be a good story to tell? Certainly my inner cynic believed that. Indeed, my inner cynic was already planning on it. But that didn't account for the feeling that I was suddenly on the verge of bursting into tears and grabbing her shoulders, begging her for answers. But answers to what? I thanked her several times in a "let's wrap this up" tone, but she kept stabbing around, and I kept offering more bones, but she had a stunningly poor strike rate. "She had certainly given me a lot to think about," I said in a more definitive tone, picking up her purse and handing it to her. "Well, I'm happy to do it," she said cheerfully. "There's something about you," she repeated. "You're dealing with so much sadness." "Yes," I acknowledged, "that's true. And I need the training," she said. "Well, thank you for, this was, you're very kind," I said, which was all true. She seemed very kind. "Can I walk you out?" After she left, I sat on the bed, and it was there in a tiny room in a town that I lived over half a century ago, where I knew no one except now Constance, that I realized I hadn't completely surrendered to grief as much as I thought I had, because I hadn't asked myself the biggest question of all, which was, how do I feel whole again? How do I feel whole after losing both my parents, after my son's leaving to live their own lives after losing my family home, after friends dying, even losing much of my natural optimism in the face of crushing political realities. How do I feel whole? And how will I feel whole in the future when there are even more inevitable losses? In that moment, it dawned on me that I had been secretly hoping for answers from Constance, not more questions. Rainier Maria Rilke wrote, "Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing, live along some distant day into the answer." I have been living this question about how to feel whole again ever since. And I am only now understanding that the gift of Constance was her spectacular wrongness. It gave me nothing to hang on to. I am the only person with the answers, if there are any. I was and am unformed, inchoate, and missing pieces. I am not whole, not now. And I may never achieve wholeness, but it is a spectacular question to live.